Okay, well, welcome along to this first in a series of talks on pages from New Zealand history. They'll be taking place over the next few Tuesday nights. Next week, Jared Davidson, just here, will be talking about his book, Remains to be Seen, about Joe Hill's ashes and the IWW, the International Workers of the World, in New Zealand. The week after that, Murray Horton will be speaking about repression in New Zealand in World War II and the attempt to introduce peacetime conscription just after World War II and the campaign against that. And the following week, I'll be talking about the 1951 waterfront dispute and also relating it a bit to what's happening in the ports of Auckland at present. That'll be the end of that first four, but we're looking to organise some more after that, looking at things like the No Maoris No Tour campaign of the early 1960s in relation to South Africa and the anti-Vietnam War movement and struggles by Maori as well. But anyway, tonight we're kicking off by looking at the White New Zealand policy, and you can see there pictures of Richard Seddon, the most famous leader of the Liberal Party, and I think he's one of the longest serving, or the longest serving Prime Minister. Michael Joseph Savage, the first Labour Prime Minister, and William Massey, the leader of the Reform Party, who I think is probably the second longest serving Prime Minister. Now, although they were all competing, supposedly competing opposed political parties, one of the questions on which they were all united was the desire to keep the Chinese out of New Zealand and to encourage Chinese people who were already living here to leave. So I'm going to look at who made the White New Zealand policy and how and why. Okay, but first, what was the White New Zealand policy? And I'm basically referring to a set of immigration controls rather than kind of domestic laws. Essentially, the White New Zealand and White Australia, the White California, the White Canada policy, they were all around the white settler dominions, Pacific Rim, and in the case of the United States as well, especially in California. So they were designed to keep out Asians, most especially the Chinese, and more directed at the Chinese than anybody else. And there are some reasons for that I'll look at a bit later. But one reason was that Indians and some other Asian migrants couldn't actually be excluded from places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa because they were Commonwealth citizens. And so they passed a law, and even in relation to the Chinese, there was a problem that the British had a treaty with the Chinese as well.
Did that include Hong Kong?
Sorry? Yes, yeah.
Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So Hong Kong Chinese could come?
Well, the idea of the White New Zealand policy was to exclude Chinese per se, but they ran into problems because of the treaty with China and because of the position of Hong Kong Chinese. So the problem with just passing laws saying no Chinese was that the British had a treaty with China, and the legislation in New Zealand at that stage, there was a chunk of New Zealand legislation that would get royal assent. It had to be signed off on by the Queen, and of course the British government couldn't really agree to legislation that specifically named and barred the Chinese when they had a treaty with China, and when some Chinese, like in Hong Kong, actually had British or Commonwealth citizenship. So it made things a little bit trickier. Now the key era of the White New Zealand policy is in the 1880s and 1890s, the 1900s and the 1910s. In 1920, there's a final piece of legislation, the Immigration Restriction Act of 1920, which basically closes the door on Chinese immigration. So it's not really an issue again in New Zealand really until, well, probably like the 1980s, 1990s, and it's more recently become an issue again. There was the first piece of legislation was in 1881, but there were some attempts in 1879 and 1880 to get legislation restricting Chinese immigration. And like I mentioned, similar policies were adopted in Canada, the USA and Australia. And actually probably more people in New Zealand have heard of the White Australia policy than would have heard of the White New Zealand policy. One of the things about Australia is that racism is probably more kind of out in the open in Australia, and so it also means that kind of organising against it is more sort of determined and militant as well. And the Australians, in New Zealand, you know, things are sort of a bit more kind of polite and British and so on, and lots of things are swept under the carpet. And so the White New Zealand policy, like, it hardly ever gets mentioned, it hardly ever gets written about it. Like, if you go and you look up White Australia policy, you'll find heaps of information, and there's a whole number of books that have been written about it. In New Zealand, there's never been a book written about the White New Zealand policy. There's a few MAs and on it, and BA honours essays and so on, but that's pretty much it. It's very, very limited, and I suggest why that's the case. So yeah, when you're looking at the historiography, that is historical writing about the White New Zealand policy, there's actually not a lot of it, especially in published terms. So there's not a lot to actually critically reflect. What there is tends to lack any sort of clear theoretical analytical framework. It's primarily narrative, so it just kind of, you know, relates what happened rather than trying to analyse what's going on and why it happened. And there's quite a lack of evidence as well in a lot of writing about the White New Zealand policy. There's certain claims that are made that I'm going to talk about shortly that are really surprisingly uncluttered by evidence. Lots of confused political characterisations. And so, for instance, a group of people who originally opposed the restrictive legislation are often referred to as liberal humanitarians in the upper house, but actually those people were really socially conservative. They were opponents of women's suffrage and opponents of factory reform legislation and so on. There's little examination of racial theories of the time, which it seems to me to be quite important in looking at how and why the White New Zealand policy came about. And there's also little in the way of comparative work. So people write about the White New Zealand policy as if it was just a thing by itself, and as if there's nothing to be learned through the much more advanced scholarship about the White Australia and White Canada policies, the policies in the United States and in South Africa against the same people who are being discriminated against in New Zealand. So the existing accounts, how do they explain the White New Zealand policies? Well, there's not much explanation, but one of the explanations that they give is that it was based on fear of the other. So, you know, people who looked differently had different physical features. It's somehow just automatic that they would be picked out and discriminated against. And of course that's not very satisfactory, because everybody has different, you know, we don't all look alike anyway, and there's lots of physical different features among Pākehā, among Europeans in general, and among all kinds of different people of all different sort of nationalities and so on, and people who look different in all kinds of ways. So it doesn't really explain why some particular set of physical features would be seized upon. Like, the physical features are just something that exists. Why would they be seized upon? And why would they be seized upon at one point in time when they weren't at another point in time? Like during the Enlightenment in Europe, China was very respected. It was quite sort of exalted. In a very different situation by the mid to late 1800s. The other way in which writers have explained or attempted to explain the White New Zealand policy is that it was based on economic competition. Because the idea is that the White New Zealand policy was driven by the working class, and that workers in New Zealand, mainly talking about Pākehā workers, didn't like economic competition from cheap Asian labour, and therefore they drove the formation of the White New Zealand policy. And the problem with that explanation, well, there's a number of problems with that explanation. One is that there were very few Chinese here, so it wasn't like they were a major competition to Pākehā workers anyway. But also, the campaigns against the Chinese happened in bad economic times when some other ethnic group might be scapegoated, but they also happened in prosperous economic times. And furthermore, the demand of workers tended to be to halt immigration in general. There weren't workers' protests to halt Chinese immigration. There were workers' protests to halt immigration because they were those protests took place in difficult economic times when workers were worried about other people coming in and competition in general. And it was actually politicians who turned it around and would start introducing anti-Chinese themes into it. The other problem is that how often do the powers that be give in to working class demands? Like, it's not really very likely that there were all these nice politicians in Parliament who didn't want to discriminate against the Chinese, but the clamour of the working class was just so strong that they felt they had no alternative but to give in to the demands of these awful prejudiced white workers. So I don't think that really holds up. There was certainly prejudice within some elements of the working class, and within trade unions, especially within craft-type unions, and within unions that were very much influenced by, and in some cases led by, liberal middle-class types. Unions in New Zealand were kind of quite strange mixture of institutions in the 1800s. Like, a lot of unions were led by kind of middle-class do-gooders in the 1800s. So there's this also this idea that I mentioned before, that the prejudice was in the working class, and there were these nice liberal upper class people in the upper house, in the old legislative council, who were opposed to these, who were shocked and horrified by how illiberal and backward and prejudiced the workers were, and who defended British standards of fair play and justice. And yet when I look through the evidence from the parliamentary debates, it was actually largely bullshit. And the people who were these liberal humanitarians, they were hardcore reactionaries. The only thing that they were liberal on was they wanted as low an age of consent for females as possible. They wanted to keep the age of consent for females at about 13. That was what their liberality consisted of. Well, yeah, and everything else, they were really unliberal. Okay, so yeah, there's a number of issues raised by those types of explanation that I don't think show that those explanations are not very satisfactory when you look at the evidence. Anyway, my approach, and I'm basically this was something I worked on for about 6 years. It was a PhD. So my approach was to look at critiques of the whole concept of race, because actually we know there's no such thing as race. Anyway, there's no basis for it in biology and so on. So now, even the very notion of race is very discredited. So I looked at the critique of race and attempts to add racial explanations of what was happening. But also examining racial thinking of the period, because the fact that there isn't such a thing as race doesn't mean that people don't think in those terms. They obviously do. And to understand what was going on, you do have to look at the racial thinking of that particular period. I wanted to look at why hostility to the Chinese went across class and political cleavages, like it was something that united people from the far right through the moderate right, the moderate left, and even into some sections of the far left, although the people who tended to be most against the White New Zealand policy were people on the far left. Okay, and then looking at the dominant ideology of the time And this is a period, the late 1800s and the early 1900s, is really a period when the nation state is really being solidified in New Zealand. In the mid-1800s, and even like up until, say, 1876, when the provinces were abolished, New Zealand wasn't really a nation state in a kind of full sense. Everything was, or a lot of things were still very provincial, political allegiances and so on. And it's really the last couple of decades of the 1800s that New Zealand becomes a nation state, and not just any kind of nation state, but a capitalist nation state. So if you're looking at who's in and who's out, then you have to look at that process of the creation of a capitalist nation state, which New Zealand historians are really, really reluctant to look at because they don't like to talk about capitalism in New Zealand, and they don't like to talk about class in New Zealand, and they don't like to have a critical attitude towards the nation state or New Zealand nationalism. In fact, one of the big problems with historical writing about the white New Zealand policy is that so much of the white New Zealand policy was actually made by liberal middle class people. And of course, who are historians in New Zealand? They're overwhelmingly politically liberal middle class people, and it was people just like them who were mainly, or who were very largely responsible for the white New Zealand policy. So all the necessary fictions that they have about themselves means that they can't really deal with the fact that it was them, or people the same as them, who were largely responsible for the white New Zealand policy. And New Zealand nationalism is very pervasive, and it's not just a right-wing thing. It exists on the left, it exists in the political centre as well, and it's very difficult to actually kind of deal with the connection between liberal New Zealand nationalism and the white New Zealand policy, because it was liberal New Zealand nationalists who were very more implicated in the white New Zealand policy really than kind of right-wing nationalists. They were there, but they weren't as big a force. Okay, and the other thing that I looked at as a part of an approach was social control theories. Because obviously in any capitalist society there's different classes, there's all kinds of clashes based on material interests that go on, but it's necessary to have political stability, it's necessary to have forms of social control, and divide and rule and those kinds of things are quite important in that. And I also looked at a lot of, I looked at everything that was published that I could find on the white Australia policy, the white Canada policy, what was happening in California, and so on as well. Now, looking at primary sources, and I looked at the main primary sources I looked at were newspaper articles, some people's personal papers, like the Robert Stout papers, who was a prominent Liberal politician, and I looked at the Macmillan Brown papers, and I trawled through years and years and years, about 40 years of parliamentary debates. The newspapers I looked at were Liberal newspapers, like the main newspaper in Christchurch in the late 1800s was still the Littleton Times. So I looked quite a lot at the Littleton Times, also a bit at the Press, the New Zealand Herald, and I looked at probably the largest circulation kind of radical paper, the Maryland Worker, as well. Okay, so that's to understand the social forces and ideas at work, test the existing interpretations. So those were the kind of sources that I looked at. And books and pamphlets in the period as well. Okay, an examination of the primary sources showed that hostility to the Chinese wasn't confined to, and nor did it start in working class communities, which was what the dominant New Zealand historical writing claimed. And like I say, usually unencumbered by footnotes and references and proof. It was usually just claimed, and one writer would claim it, and then that writer would be cited by some other writer And so then it becomes part of a kind of established historical fact, when actually originally it was just a claim without any evidence whatsoever. The sources also showed that racial thinking is top-down, that to the extent that prejudice existed in the working class, it didn't originate there, it originated elsewhere. And this was one case where there was a trickle-down effect. Yeah, and that the principled and humanitarian upper house opponents of anti-Chinese bills were actually hardcore reactionaries, which you wouldn't know at all from the literature. And yet it's very evident when you go and examine their voting records and their speeches in Parliament and so on. So the literature on the White New Zealand policy is really quite shocking.
What was their motive?
Sorry?
What was...
I'll come to that. Yep. Yeah. Now, so the several upper class members who did staunchly and in principle oppose exclusion measures were completely atypical of the upper house. So there was just a very tiny number of people in the upper house who did oppose the exclusion, and they were completely atypical of the upper house and of the people in the upper house who might criticise bits of legislation because they thought that the working class was vulgar, and that having too blatant a White New Zealand policy was vulgar, or that you couldn't send a certain bill to the Queen because she would think, Queen Victoria would think you were vulgar, and so it had to be organised better. So the reasons that the so-called humanitarians were opposed to it was, one, they were pretty much opposed to any legislation by the Liberal Party on principle. They just always voted against Liberal Party legislation. Two, they liked to pretend that they were, that they believed in a sort of British sense of fair play and so on. But their disagreements were really only over things like numbers, like they were in favour of having a White New Zealand policy as soon as there were 5,000 Chinese in New Zealand, which wasn't exactly, generous, spirited. Whereas the Liberals, people like Pember Reeves and so on, were trying to stop the numbers like way before they ever got to 5,000. These people in the upper house, the main body of people who supposedly opposed the legislation, also argued that you needed cheap Asian labour to make certain industries profitable. So they actually did believe in using cheap labour to undermine workers' conditions in New Zealand. So all their arguments were really reactionary. But like I say, there were a couple of people in the upper house who opposed the legislation. They were completely atypical. They tended to be kind of like bohemian or sort of detached radical members of the upper class who certainly were not part of the main body of the upper class. A couple of interesting people actually. There's a guy in Canterbury called Brett who had been a major or something in the British Army, but who was quite progressive and was involved in supporting small farmers against big landowners and so on. So very, very atypical of that block of people in the Legislative Council who were, big landowners, big factory owners, and so on. Now, very few workers attended meetings which passed agreements calling for the exclusion of the Chinese. There's very little evidence that there was any significant number of workers who were running around campaigning against the Chinese, despite the efforts of liberal journalists and liberal politicians and conservative politicians to try and G up the working class. They never really had very much success in doing so. So, for instance, even at union meetings, and there was quite a lot of union meetings which passed anti-Chinese stuff, but you'd look down at the records, and there'd be like 20 people there, and like 15 people would vote for it, and 5 might vote against or something. And it's like it's not real. It's not really the working class. Okay, so the evidence from primary sources tend to show the opposite of what was claimed in most of the historiography. So who did make the White New Zealand policy? Well, in the 1880s and the 1890s, the primary architects of the legislation were people like William Pember Reeves, you know, the sort of great hero of kind of liberal progressive, the mainstream of liberal progressive New Zealand, and King Dick, Richard Seddon. And they were usually nice, liberal, middle class folk. Lots of factory reformers, lots of people who were trying to reform factory conditions, bring in, you know, progressive-ish legislation on factory conditions. Lots of suffragists, lots of people who were advocating for the right of women to vote were incredibly racist against the Chinese. And I'll talk about why that was towards the end. So very little evidence that the massive workers had much interest in excluding the Chinese. And of course, workers had very little political power anyway. It wasn't like there was some big, powerful workers' movement that was forcing governments to adopt legislation that they didn't want to adopt. Now, the impact of economic competition and unemployment certainly played a role. But like I said before, when there was economic competition with migrant workers and when there were periods of unemployment, and of course there was a long depression from the end of the 1860s to the early 1890s, a long period, what's called the Long Depression. What workers within New Zealand tended to do, and I mean they were first generation or second generation migrants anyway, was to demand a halt to immigration per se. And the vast majority of immigration was immigration from Britain. But what would happen would be they'd be having some march and some unscrupulous politician like Reeves or somebody else would turn up and they would try and introduce a motion that would direct the protest exclusively against the Chinese, and they'd bring in some bill into Parliament. Like in the early 1890s, Reeves and Seddon were just introducing bill after bill after bill, just at an incredible pace to try and get stuff passed that would halt basically non-white immigration, but it was particularly the Chinese that they didn't like. But very important in the role that racism did play within the white working class was the impact of middle class ideological and organisational hegemony over workers. And if you go and you look at material about the unions in like the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and even into the 1890s, like they weren't really workers' organisations. They were very much dominated by these kind of liberal middle class do-gooder elements who were reading racial theories in Europe. And of course at that point in time, those ideas were very mainstream. You know, like ideas that later were carried out by the Nazis, and so they tended to get discredited. I mean, we had in this country loads of nice middle-class lawyers and doctors and judges who believed that the lower end of the working class should be castrated and not allowed to reproduce and should actually be, well, chemically castrated. They weren't in favour of chopping people's balls off. Well, some of them probably were actually, but they were in favour of the castration of the lower end of the working class. So they weren't kind of like wild, extreme right-wing views. They were part of the mainstream of thinking among nice liberal people. And when you read stuff about, like the eugenics movement in New Zealand in the early 1900s, and you think, God, these people are Nazis. And then, of course, you realise that, no, they're not. They're mainstream liberal. That was what part of mainstream liberal thinking, 100 years ago. And these people, those kinds of people, had real influence in working class communities, and in particular in institutions like the trade unions and kind of workers' improvement associations as well. And in fact, when I was doing the PhD, I was looking around the wall at pictures of people in the WEA, you know, like some of the people who were founders of the WEA don't really have a wonderful record in terms of some of this stuff. Oops. Okay, so that's the kind of 1880 to 1900 period. At that stage, the people who are advocating the White New Zealand policy, there's still a fair bit of opposition to it. And one of the other interesting things was that a lot of opposition came even from mining areas. And in mining areas, there was a degree of competition between Chinese miners and New Zealand miners. And part of the historiography of the White New Zealand policy argues that those districts, that it was miners who drove a lot of the White New Zealand policy, that they were extremely racist against the Chinese with whom they were competing. Well, there was a degree of competition, but there was also quite a lot of degree in which there wasn't competition, because the Chinese tended to actually try and work seams that European miners had abandoned. There wasn't loads of competition on the spot, but also one of the things that I found was that in the 1890s there was a number of MPs from mining areas who were strongly opposed to the White New Zealand policy, to attempts to introduce it. So if they were trying to get elected by miners, you know, and the miners were so racist, they weren't going about it very well. And since, you know, if the miners were so prejudiced, it's very unlikely that these MPs would be against the immigration restrictions. So it's more likely that that a lot of the miners actually weren't so hostile to the Chinese, and that's why these people could express much more. I don't know if I quite call them internationalists. They tended to be more kind of humanitarian, you know, fair play, justice-y sort of ideas. But you can see a change. Yeah.
But isn't there some meaning in the Chinese working extended seams that if the Chinese founded their own seam or tried to make a claim to it, their claim might not be legitimate, or they might get beaten up and moved off? That the Chinese sort of understand it's tolerable to use a seam that white people have finished with. Yep. And use their better techniques, or just live cheaper, or whatever they did.
That certainly happened. And actually, originally the Chinese were brought in as miners to Otago when the gold had run out, and people were moving out of Otago, and the Chamber of Commerce wanted to try and keep the gold fields going, and they brought the Chinese in to work seams that European miners had already left. So there wasn't really much competition anyway.
But I'd still see that as kind of racist, or the Chinese are reading some unwritten law that you can work over here, but don't challenge anybody and think you're going to get a big stake and make it big. You can use what we're finished with, and that's it. There
was some of that, but it certainly wasn't the dominant thing that was going on in the mines. Okay. In the gold mines. But it changes, because around 1900 you can see a shift as anti-Chinese sentiment becomes a lot more generalised. And so even somebody like J.P. O'Regan, John Patrick O'Regan, who was a West Coast progressive journalist, and he became MP. He's actually Tiffany O'Regan's granddad. He was a migrant from Ireland, or his parents came here from Ireland. And he was a defender of the Chinese in the 1880s and 1890s, but by the early 1900s, he's shifted over. And a whole number of people have shifted over from being defenders of the rights of the Chinese to being hostile. And ironically, the shift in O'Regan parallels a political shift that he made towards the trade unions. Originally he was a Liberal MP, and when he became kind of more committed to the labour movement, he actually became more anti-Chinese. Now you have in the early 1900s just a growth of a whole set of ideas that were held by the kind of liberal, the mainstream liberal section of New Zealand society, and on the right and on part of the left as well. You have the growth of things like the eugenics movement, which was quite a significant movement in New Zealand. And in fact, some of the places where the eugenicists were worse were in liberal countries, like in Sweden, which we think of as a liberal progressive country. You know, like they were still sterilising people there up until the 1970s. Like eugenics was really, really strong in Sweden, and it was strong here as well in the early 1900s. After World War I, you've got the Returned Servicemen's Association, and they had like a 10-point platform, and one of them was the White New Zealand policy. The National Defence League, which was led by, what's his name, escapes me at present, General Sir somebody or other. But he was the guy who led Massey's Cossacks in 1913. Somebody might remember his name.
Was he in the army or was he like...
Yeah, he was in the army, yeah, but he'd been the leader of Massey's Cossacks in 1913.
Yeah.
Yeah, whatever his name was. But he set up the National Defence League, and it was like all around the world, or certainly in like Europe and North America, Australia, New Zealand, after World War I, there was the emergence of these right-wing nationalist movements. And in Italy, you know, it was the fascisti, and in Germany, the Nazis and so on. And in countries like Australia and New Zealand, we had groups like the NDL. I mean, it was led by this guy, who had led Massey's Cossacks in 1913. The Farmers' Union, which wasn't really farmers, it was big farmers, it was dominated by big farmers, and the Labour Party. Now, the New Zealand Labour Party was a bit different from the Australian Labour Party, because when the Australian Labour Party was formed, it had like I can't remember how many points, like a 5-point program or a 6-point program. And normally you'd expect the Labour Party, you know, like the number 1 point would be nationalisation of the means of production, distribution and exchange. They never planning on carrying it out, but it would be the number 1. But not the Australian Labour Party. The number 1 point on their party platform when they were founded was the White Australia policy. And interestingly, you get collaboration between the NDL and the Labour Party, between this guy who was the leader of the NDL and the Labour Party, along with the Farmers' Union and the eugenics movement and so on after World War I, this huge determination to keep out the Chinese. So you have, on the one hand, you have Harry Holland united with the leader of Massey's Cossacks from 1913. They united around keeping out the Chinese. And not just united in a sort of vague sense, but actually coming together. And of course the other two main political parties, well at this stage both of them are bigger than Labour, Liberals and Reform. The Liberal Party and the Reform Party are campaigning for the White New Zealand as well. So after, so from 1880s, 1890s, you've got more and more legislation. So the first piece in 1881, basically it introduces a poll tax. So to be Chinese to come into New Zealand, you have to pay £10, which in those days was a hell of a lot of money. And the legislation starts to say that ships coming into New Zealand can only have like 1 Chinese per so many tonnage of the ship. So if the ship's like 100 tonnes, it can only have like 1 Chinese on it. There's more legislation several times in the 1880s, and especially the two main pieces are 1881 and 1887. And then in the early 1890s, the poll tax is increased to £100, you know, which is a fortune in those days. So to be Chinese and come in, you have to pay £100. And the tonnage is massively increased. So now there's only 1 Chinese can come in per several hundred tonnes of shipping. They run into problems continuously with things like those bills have to go to Britain to get royal assent, and there are those complications because of Hong Kong and because of the British treaty with the Chinese. And of course in Australia and New Zealand, the regimes want to exclude the Japanese as well, but Japan was Britain's ally during World War I. And European racists had an interesting attitude towards Japan. Like a lot of people who were really anti-Chinese were quite favourable towards Japan because they thought the Japanese were like the Asian British, that it was an island country and it had a similar climate to Britain and it bred similar sort of superior people. I mean, not as superior as the British, but kind of like they were the best Asians. And like New Zealand had the best we had the best natives. And so on. So anyway, after World War I, you get campaigns by the three main political parties: Labour, the Liberals, Reform, and Labour, the MDL, the RSA, and the Farmers Union, and also the leadership of the union movement. And you can see within the union movement, over a period of a couple of decades, the growth of anti-Asian, especially anti-Chinese sentiment. So that what was still just starting to be formed in the 1880s and 1890s, by the early 1900s, and especially by the time you're at the end of World War I, starting to become hegemonic within chunks of the union movement, as well as among business and employers organisations, right-wing political parties, and so on. Now, the 1920 Immigration Restriction Act. The other piece of legislation in the 1890s, in a way that they got around the royal assent issue, was they introduced a language test. And it's called the Natal test because it was done first in South Africa. And what you would do would be you'd introduce some kind of writing test, and you would organise the writing test in such a way that Chinese people couldn't pass it, but you could say, well, the legislation doesn't name the Chinese, it just says that people have to pass this kind of literacy writing test. But then they would work it in such a way that it was particularly directed against the Chinese. The final, and then in the early 1900s, 1907, a lot of the acts were consolidated, the legislation was consolidated. But the kind of the cherry on top of the icing on the cake was the Immigration Restriction Act of 1920. And what this did was it removed it from public view by changing the immigration controls to where it was a member of the government, the responsible minister, who could say yay or nay to people coming in. And so anybody with a Chinese name, he just wouldn't let, he wouldn't let them in. And it was out of the public domain. So it was just a decision, like in the hands of one member of the government. And so the Chinese had kind of no-show, and Chinese migration slowed up altogether. Now, of course, if you discriminate against people at the point of entry, then the logic is the one that you're going to discriminate against the ones here. And so you had a growth of attacks on Chinese people, which culminated in the murder of a Chinese guy in Wellington in 1905 by a guy called Lionel Terry, who was locked up down in Cherry Farm. He was declared insane, but actually if you read what he wrote, it was fairly mainstream. I mean, it was pretty racist and offensive and all the rest of it, but it was pretty mainstream. People were saying things in Parliament that went much different from what he was saying. You had, like, the RSA stirred up anti-Chinese riots in Timaru and elsewhere and got people to wreck Chinese fruiterers' shops. You also had members of Parliament and business complaining that the working class were going into Chinese shops and buying vegetables, and that if you left it up to the working class, you'd never have the Chinese excluded, because the working class were going into Chinese fruit and vegetable shops and buying the fruit and vegetables and using Chinese laundries and so on. So even in 1920, like, attitudes in the working class when the white New Zealand kind of people hadn't succeeded in completely hegemonising the working class. They were still complaining that the working class weren't sufficiently racist and patriotic and nationalist enough. Okay, yeah, so that 1920 Act closed the door on Chinese immigration, took the issue out of the public and the political sphere, and so it basically, although you had anti-Chinese campaigns afterwards, like there were campaigns in the parts of the North Island around Chinese market gardeners in the 1920s. There was a very nasty campaign that was started really by Nata, who was very worried about Chinese market gardeners and corrupting virtuous Maori maidens. And so there was a whole sort of moral panic whipped up that there were, these virtuous Maori maidens were being led up the vegetable path into the cabbage patch by degenerate Chinese men. One of the ironies of this, of course, was that the Chinese population in New Zealand was almost entirely male. Like, there was only about 9 Chinese women in New Zealand in about 1900. So the poor Chinese men, they weren't allowed to have sex with European women. They weren't allowed to have sex with Maori women, and then they got accused of, one of the big accusations against the Chinese was that they were onanists, which I assume everybody knows, meant that they masturbated a lot. And you're kind of thinking, well, they weren't allowed to have sex with anybody, they lost out, whatever they did. But after that 1920 Act, it's not for another kind of 50 or 60 years that you get the same kind of panics and racist campaigns around immigration. Now, why the White New Zealand policies? And it's useful to look not just at the New Zealand situation, but what was happening in California, in Canada, especially in British Columbia, in Australia, and in New Zealand, and to some extent in South Africa, but especially the Pacific Rim kind of white settler societies. Now, the White New Zealand policy, I concluded, was an integral part of nation building in New Zealand. It wasn't something that ran against the, some liberal progressive view of nation building. It was actually part and parcel of nation building in New Zealand.
In how far had religion anything to do with it?
Not really very much, no.
Because
not much
you
at all.
mentioned the word onanist, that is a typical religious
word. Yes. No, that was just a word that was generally used for masturbation in those days.
That's why I say that.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a religious background as we as white people have superiority.
No, it was because at that stage there was massive fear about racial degeneration in Europe, and there were all kinds of strange beliefs like that masturbation undermined the virility of the white race, and there were all kinds of implements that men were suggested to use to stop them from spilling their seed in a way that didn't impregnate women. And so it was a general fear that applied to, there were campaigns against European masturbation as well, but it was just assumed that the Chinese did it more, and they may have done because they didn't. What else were they going to do? But yeah, it just so happens that particular word comes from the Bible, but it didn't have any sort of particular religious significance in terms of the Chinese. Now, the connection with nation building, I think, is that there were very specific forms of nationalism shared by white settler colonies and former colonies in the Pacific Rim, and these involved selecting for particular citizen characteristics. And of course, this was a period in which what's called scientific racism was really strong. And this idea of selecting for particular characteristics in human populations partly drove eugenics, but it had a big influence on immigration policy. And one of the reasons that liberals were so anti-Chinese was because they bought into those same particular arguments, and I'll get into that a bit more shortly. Now, the discrimination against the Chinese tended to be based on the degree to which different groups were seen to offend against these required characteristics. So if you offended against, say there were these 10 things and you offended against one or two of them, you probably weren't going to be much affected by discrimination. If you offended against a whole bunch of them, then you would be. I mean, there were all kinds of people who fell into that, like New Zealand society, they didn't want deaf people and they didn't want people who had some kind of physical handicap. So you didn't have much chance of getting in if you had some kind of physical impairment, because you'd offend against these characteristics. And one of the conclusions that I came to was that the Chinese were most discriminated against because they were seen as offending most in terms of these characteristics. And I'll look at these characteristics. And one of the problems was that New Zealand was actually conceived as a liberal, progressive society by colonists. Like a lot of people assume that people like Wakefield were reactionaries. Actually, they were liberals, although liberals with a small L. Like Wakefield didn't like the upper class in England, and he'd actually been imprisoned by the upper class in England for having the temerity to run off with some lord's daughter when she was about 18. So there was lots of things about England that he didn't like. Wakefield and the people around him who drew up the colonisation plans for New Zealand, their idea was to have something that was culturally like a piece of England, but escaped the complete class rigidity of England. And a lot of them were like from aspiring middle class backgrounds, or maybe they were the second and third son who, and they could see these sort of chinless wonders from the aristocracy, holding positions of power in England, and they didn't think it was fair because they thought they were way more suited to run society. So they wanted a society that was a bit more egalitarian than Britain. And their idea was that, like Wakefield's land settlement and a sufficient price, was that you'd establish a class society in New Zealand, but it would be a kind of meritocratic class society, and people could come in and kind of work their way up, and you'd get to the top on merit, and you wouldn't have this aristocracy there. And so certain types of people were being selected for. So for instance, when migrants from Britain were being selected for, they wanted agricultural labourers of sober habits. So agricultural labourers who didn't drink, who didn't go having sex with loads of women all over the place and so on. But they didn't want agricultural labourers who were completely, doffing the cap all the time either. They wanted sort of kind of intelligent but well-behaved people coming here and settling New Zealand and having a kind of liberal, progressive-ish democracy. Of course, under capitalism, there's actually severe limits to how far you can go with that, and they ran up against those limits. But it meant that there was quite a selection process that went on about who could come to New Zealand and who couldn't. And so the desirable characteristics for New Zealanders were these ones on the left. Like, they wanted to build a modern, progressive country, moving forward into a bold future, and they wanted a vigorous and resourceful population. Now, China had been seen in a very positive light in Europe during the Enlightenment. Then Europe went through the Industrial Revolution, and Europe got ahead of China. And the perceptions of China changed. And because China wasn't really moving anywhere and Europe was moving ahead, the perception was like that China was going backward. And so intellectuals and stuff in Europe started talking about China and the Chinese as suffering arrested development, and as having these characteristics of being a country of arrested development, a degenerating population, and there were massive fears in Europe in the late 1800s and early 1900s of the racial degeneration of Europeans, that modern civilization was making Europeans soft and so on. And one of the strange things about a lot of the anti-Chinese people in New Zealand, like Seddon, was they're really quite pro-Maori. They were in favour of miscegenation. Like Seddon made James Carroll Prime Minister when he was out of the country. He used to go like, oh, look at James Carroll, what a fantastic example of the mingling of Maori and Pākehā. You've produced this master race. Because it was felt that the European brain with the sort of Maori oomph would create a superior race in New Zealand, whereas Seddon said, he'd rather kill one of his kids than see them marry a Chinese. So very different attitudes towards Maori than towards Chinese. New Zealand was supposed to be a land of high living standards, whereas China was seen as a land of mass poverty. New Zealand was supposed to be free of old world evils, and so, like the Liberals, when there was a landed aristocracy developing, the Liberals broke up the landed estates in the 1890s. Supposed to be healthy, moral population, well housed and fed, whereas China was seen as having lots of inequality, overcrowding, disease, slums, illiteracy, lots of immorality. And you even got people, members of parliament saying that if a European went into the slums in China, they'd die just from the stench and the disease. But Chinese had become adapted to it, and they couldn't survive in clean air. They required this filthy kind of slum air in order to, that was like their oxygen. New Zealand was supposed to be democratic, ruggedly egalitarian, and so on, whereas China was seen as a despotic society with a slavish population. And the population of New Zealand wasn't supposed to be slavish. And this is where, loads of liberals were anti-Chinese because they embraced these values on the left that the Chinese were supposed to be against. New Zealand men were supposed to be strong and masculine, and Chinese men were seen as being effeminate, onanists, homosexuals. And again, who were they supposed to have sex with? They weren't allowed to have sex with women. So even if they, didn't really have much choice to have sex with each other or to masturbate, and then that got them into more trouble. And in the white New Zealand policy, politician after politician would get up and say, this isn't about Maori, we don't want anybody discriminating against Maori, because they're really good, they're the best natives in the world, they're the next best thing to Europeans. But the Chinese are very, very different. Now I just want to finish off by going very quickly something about the Labour Party, because we're sort of looking at Lucas history in this. Before the 1900s, like I said before, labour movement organisations that argued for immigration restrictions tended to use economic arguments in general against immigration. They weren't always racist, but it's over time that changes and there's a shift to racial arguments. In July 1919, the Labour Conference looked at banning members of any coloured race from entering New Zealand. There's this sort of idea about how wonderful the early Labour Party was and the first Labour government was, but if you actually read what they thought on some of these questions, I think Michael Joseph Savage certainly wouldn't have the reputation that he has as being a sort of saint. And in April 1920, Savage and other Labour MPs, Parry and Bartram, sent a telegram to Massey, which is, it's interesting to read the telegram and see how progressive Savage was. Savage raised the spectre of an alarming influx of Asiatics, lowering living standards, and Savage was very worried about New Zealand becoming what he called a piebald race, through having Asiatics and Pākehā mixing with Asiatics. And we'd all we'd have kind of piebald colouring or features.
What does the word piebald mean?
It's like a horse and it's got, it's white and it's got spots on it,
right,
dark spots, In June 1920, Auckland watersiders refused to work ships carrying Asiatic, they were always referred to as Asiatic, and there was always an influx. There was always hordes, and they swarmed. They were never like people who moved, from one place to another. They always swarmed. There was always an influx. and warned of a piebald population if Asians and whites intermixed. They'll be horrified at the number of New Zealanders, especially like young New Zealanders today, who intermix quite freely with Asians. In July 1920, one of the great ironies, the Labour Party conference had a special guest of honour. Oh, this is the guy, yeah. General Sir Andrew Russell, founder and Führer of the National Defence League. The NDL's number one object was the White New Zealand policy. Now, you think it would be a bit strange to have the head of Massey's Cossacks as a special guest at the Labour Party conference. You know, it's only like 6 years after, 7 years after, Waihi and so on. But the reason that he was there was because they shared the same view in relation to the White New Zealand policy. And Russell said, if something like Waihi happened again, I wouldn't do what I did then, because I really like you guys, because you're as anti-Asian as what I am. Let's get together against the Asians, and I won't batter their heads anymore. That conference heard a report from a committee from the conference of the previous year, which criticised the Reform government. So this is like Massey's reactionary government. Labour criticised them for not doing enough to curb Asian immigration. And the Labour Party worried about an intermingling of the races detrimental to all, called for more rigid educational tests to keep out, which I think kind of like, it's the Labour Party, they want more rigid educational tests to keep out low-class people. But it was a way of, keeping out Asians. And they argued that the proper development of New Zealand required whites, and any significant number of Asiatics would wreak the proper development of New Zealand. And delegates who wanted further discussion were cut short by Pat Hickey, who had been one of the leaders of the Redfeds, who moved for acceptance of the report without further ado. So a chunk of the Redfed people who ended up in the Labour Party had become pretty virulent anti-Chinese racists by the period after World War I, if they hadn't already been. And Hickey declared it was Labour's duty to keep New Zealand white. Savage reckoned that keeping Asiatics out of New Zealand involved the very law of life itself. It was so important. And he raised the spectre of the teeming millions, swarming down from Asia, swarming all over New Zealand, and was especially concerned to keep the poorly educated out of New Zealand, which again is kind of ironic that the Labour Party wanted to keep the poorly educated out of New Zealand. Labour MPs took great umbrage at any suggestion by MPs from the Liberals or the Reform Party that they were any less anti-Chinese than what the Tories were. They got very upset, and they would get up and make speeches, but we've done more than anybody to keep the Asiatic swarm from the shores of Aotearoa. Dan Sullivan, who's a Labour MP in Christchurch, I think, said that Labour was as committed as any to maintain racial purity, anti-miscegenation, and wanted greater restriction than was in the proposed legislation, which of course was Reform Party, was Massey's legislation, and Labour wanted it strengthened. William Parry, another Labour MP, got up, and I'm opposed to indiscriminate mixing of the races. I mean, it's just Labour MP after Labour MP gets up during the debates on the 1920 legislation. Ted Howard, Mabel Howard's father, even got out of his sick bed to go along to Parliament. He was sick, I'm going to go along and, bang the table about how in favour of the White New Zealand policy I am. And Harry Holland, kind of interesting, because Harry Holland was still sort of a little bit more on the left, so he had to phrase his sort of anti-Chinese racism a little bit differently. So he tried to say that Labour was internationalist, but internationalism didn't mean that you wanted Asiatics in New Zealand. They needed to be kept out, and this could be done by an education test.
he also emphasised the importance of British citizenship, which was kind of funny when you know, the popular image of Harry Holland. But Harry thought that British citizenship was so precious and so valuable, you didn't just want any hoi polloi having it. Especially you didn't want kind of, you know, like Asiatics having something as precious as, you know, citizenship under the British Crown. Okay. So the position of the, you know, Labour Party, a lot of union leaders and officials was the same as the ones in Australia. And I think it's important to understand that the Labour Party in New Zealand, whatever about its origins and its links to the Red Feds and the union movement, politically it's primarily and always has been a nationalist party. It might be a nationalist party that talks about workers as opposed to a nationalist party that talks about something else. But it's primarily a nationalist party, and its nationalism always overrode its... I mean, some of us here wouldn't think that it ever was socialist, but to the extent that it had a socialist rhetoric, its nationalism always overrode its whatever commitment to socialism, pretend or otherwise, it had, even in the very early years when it was supposed to be more radical. But not everyone in the Labour movement had these views. And this is something that's really unsettling for liberal New Zealand historians. All the institutions and political forces that they believe in were all supporters of the White New Zealand policy. And it was these terrible people on the revolutionary left who were the people who were opposed to the White New Zealand policy. So, for instance, in the Second International, you had a big split over colonial policy where the people who became the Labour-type parties were making lots of concessions to the idea of empire and colonialism and so on. And on the other hand, you had, within the Second International, you had the Marxist elements who favoured anti-imperialism, open immigration policies, and who argued that instead of excluding migrant workers, you should actually welcome them and unionise them and politicise them, and that often migrant workers had more advanced class consciousness than the workers in the metropolitan countries anyway. So it tended to be the so-called moderates who had the extreme positions on racial questions, and the so-called extremist socialists who had the, you know, like humanitarian, you know, brotherhood and sisterhood type positions. I don't know a hell of a lot about the anarchism of the period, except that those divisions were found in anarchism as well. So you had, the logical anarchist position would be to be against immigration controls, but there were certainly anarchists who shared the anti-Chinese stuff, you know, like here and in other countries as well. It was very strong on the left, and it would be, you know, a miracle if there weren't some people even on the revolutionary left, whether they be pseudo-Marxists or anarchists or pseudo-anarchists or whatever, who held those views as well. And I think that is the end.